Hello, and welcome to today's session of the Adapted Screenplay. In this short course, you will learn how to approach writing a adapted screenplay, how to acquire the rights for a book or a comic book or a previous author's work in order to legally write an adapted screenplay. And then you will be able to begin on the process of doing it on your own to write a legal and well thought out adapted screenplay. First of all, what is an adapted screenplay? Well, if you remember a one movie hit from the late 90s called Fight Club, we all remember Brad Pitt, right? Saying, "Hit me as hard as you can." That was a famous line that got repeated by people over and over again. It became lay speech, joke speech, and sometimes people would say, well, just hit me as hard as you can, right? Well, if you remember that movie, then you may have not also known that that was based on a book. It became a bestseller, actually. That book, being a bestseller, was eventually noticed by Hollywood studio executives, and they grabbed that book and produced it into a movie. And because they have to market films, right, with star power, they chose Brad Pitt to star in the role. Now, that's just one example of an adapted story from a best-selling book. As a matter of fact, some of the best movies that you may not be aware of were actually adaptations from bestsellers of books. Now, do you have to base, if you're doing adaptation, do you have to base it on a best-selling book? No, you can adapt it from a book like the Bible, right? There's no copyright issues with the Bible at all, and that's the good thing. So you could take a story from the Bible, because we won't offend the writers, right? Because some of the works in the Bible, we're not quite sure who the writers are, even though we think we do know, hypothetically from circumstantial evidence, right, who wrote them. So since there's no legal entanglements on the Bible, for example, you could take any story from there and adapt it into a movie, a screenplay, typically which is between 90 to 120 pages long. So that is the length of a major motion picture for a screenplay. Now, there's also been television shows that have been adapted from famous books. Little House on the Prairie. So you may not have been old enough to watch that, but I watched that when I was a child. And it was a major hit, late 70s, early 80s, and the reruns just went on and on and on all throughout the 80s. So the good thing about the 80s, before cable and Netflix and all that became big, was that we all grew up with reruns. So if you saw it when you were a child, most likely you would keep watching it, and your younger siblings would watch what you watched because you watched reruns. But so Little House on the Prairie was actually based off a book and was made into a TV show, and it became a hit TV show. So there's different ways of adapting other authors' works. Now, you could also adapt a film from mythology, right? That's very popular. That's been done before. You can adapt a film from a famous horror character, which is already in the public domain, Dracula, right? Now, the thing is that when you write your own interpretation of a character from a famous story that's in the public domain, your interpretation becomes your copywritten material, not the character, just your interpretation. So that's really where it's at. So also, you have to be careful that when you are writing your own original works, right, that you aren't in fact adapting from someone else's work and just changing it so much just a little bit, that it will be foggy, right? That it will look like you did not, that it's not your original idea. So you have to be careful where you go with that if you do write something that is similar, because just changing the names and changing a few little details here and there, that does not guarantee that it's your own original work. But to give you an example, The Terminator, very famous movie, right, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, James Cameron, it was determined that that he actually did adapt some details from a famous writer, Harlan Ellison, and he was a sci-fi writer, and he took James Cameron to court after the first, as soon as Terminator was released, and they had to acknowledge him on the credits. So just because you take an adaptation, or just because you take material and you get inspired by something, doesn't mean that, you know, you could just change it just a tad and not give anyone acknowledgement at all. So keep that in mind. If it's significant, if you're adapting something significantly, then you should give credit where credit is due. Okay, so and another thing you should know and understand is that adaptation is based on someone else's work, right? It is based on someone else's literary work. So you don't want to plagiarize. An adaptation just isn't, you know, taking their work and putting everything in there, it just to the letter. And then, in other words, you want your own creativity into it. You want to have a point of view, a different perspective when you do adaptation. Now, if you acquire the rights, then of course you could probably do whatever you want with it. But in the sense of having respect to the original author, you do want to put a different perspective to it. You might want to put a modern twist to it. For instance, Smallville, right? That's a legal adaptation of Superman, right? But that was done in an original way. Now, all the characters, they may not have had copyright legalities to them, but it was the no flight, no tights scenario, right? They didn't want to deal with a lot of copyright with the suits and the images and all that. They pretty much just up until the end there, they could do whatever they want because the show was so successful. But they pretty much just adapted it in such a way that Superman was just a normal guy like everyone else, right? He was just a teenager, and he was growing, and he was just learning his own powers, and in fact, he didn't want to wear the suit. He thought it was kooky. He thought it was dumb. So, and he was a teenager, so he was embarrassed to wear the suit. So that was probably would be what anyone else wanted to do. So, all right. So, the big idea of adaptation is basically you want to put or you want to get something that you think is marketable, right? You want to put forward something that's marketable. Gone with the Wind, that's an adaptation by Margaret Mitchell, right? And the reason why it was so successful, or why so many people went to the theater to go see it, was because it was just as big as the book. If you read the book, it truly is a visionary piece of art. It's just got fantastic battles, fantastic scenes. It's got everything. It's got romance, epic romance, right? I mean, it's an epic movie. So the movie adapted it true to the source material, but they made it cinematic, right? So when you adapt, you have to make sure that novelizations, it's one medium, but cinema, it's another medium, right? That's adaptation. So when you look to acquire the rights, you want to go to the book publisher and explain to them first that you want to adapt it into a cinematic work. And it's got to be ethical. Without ethics, the author may not agree to do it. If the author is gone, then you may have to deal with the heirs or the book publisher who holds it in high regard. So just remember, ethics is also involved in adaptation too, because you don't want to make a former author look bad. With this in mind, thank you for joining the course. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you for joining.